So thank you again. It's a great honor to be here. And thank you so much for lasting till the end of the day. Hopefully I'll give you a talk that's going to be interesting enough so you won't fall asleep, because I know we're probably getting very tired and fatigued of listening to talking heads all day. So in addition to my activities, basically this talk is coming from my role as a geographer and a cartographer who's worked in the game industry for over 26 years. I was at Microsoft for 13 years, and where I created an internal team called Geopolitical Strategy. And my job there was to protect the company against political and cultural risks that appeared in all of Microsoft products, including all the games once the game groups got started at Microsoft. And then I went on, after I left Microsoft, to be a consultant and working on many other games and franchises. And I've worked on lots of different stuff you've heard of, like Halo and Age of Empires, and all the BioWare games of the last 18 years, and a lot of other stuff. I apologize for my voice. I'm getting over being sick last week, so my voice still hasn't 100% recovered. So I will try and croak through this as best as I can. So let's talk about game worlds and the kind of worlds that we are used to experiencing. So a lot of these worlds that we see and experience in games, we know how much work goes into these things when we're building these worlds. And of course, for the different types of worlds, like this is Skyrim, they're hyper detailed, tons of text content, tons of all kinds of fictional content that is created to develop a culture. Sometimes we're dealing with worlds that take place in our universe, but they take place in the far future, like the Halo games with science fiction. Of course, we also have games that I would consider to be hyper-real, things like GTA 5, which I find fascinating because I'm from Los Angeles originally, and I absolutely love what they did with this city of Los Santos, because they nailed LA culture 100% in all kinds of great ways. Even things like Assassin's Creed, where we take a fictional narrative and we overlay that on a real place like Venice or other locations throughout history in these games, but they have a whole fictional narrative that runs through it. And also things like Minecraft. This is a world that actually is all built on world building. That's the whole point of this game, is essentially to build worlds and to deconstruct them and do what you want in this kind of universe. And we can't forget games like casual games like Limbo, which this is also a universe that has its own set of rules. It has its own culture, so to speak, even though it might be a lot simpler than we're used to in something like a giant RPG. But it is still an experience that has to be designed and has to be thought through, even if the player doesn't see all the final detail. And of course, even something like Angry Birds. There's a narrative behind Angry Birds that oftentimes is not fully explored. The whole pigs versus birds thing and all that. Yeah, they've explored it in some of their other transmedia, like films and all that kind of thing. But even this is a universe that has rules. It's a universe that has a certain narrative behind it. And so there's a whole logic that goes with it when we're building worlds like this and building experiences for players. Now, my inspiration for becoming a cartographer was based on this, which I'm sure many of you recognize. This is Tolkien's map of Middle-earth. This is what inspired me to become a cartographer way back when. And what was great about Tolkien is that he based his world and his world-building process on his number one strength, which was language, because he was a language professor, a linguistics professor. And so the way that he chiefly brought Middle-earth to life was through the creation of language, like the Elvish language and Black speech and Dwarvish and all these other languages. And through those languages, he built the cultures, because as we know, even in our world, many of our cultures are so integrated with the language that we speak. And so now his use of geography is questionable from my standpoint as a geographer, but that's not what this talk is about. What I do find interesting, though, is that every work of especially fantasy, they use a map to basically help establish the world. Because a lot of us, as human beings, we respond to maps as an artifact of truth, and which they are not really. They're the process of a cartographer's decision-making. They're supposed to represent ground truth, but not exactly. But what I find interesting with fantasy authors, they use maps to basically show you that, hey, this place is real, or that it feels real, or it looks real, based on the fact that I've made a map. And what I find interesting, a lot of times when they're including these maps, as you're reading the narrative, and you always look in the first few pages of the book, and you'll see the map at the beginning. In a way, it's kind of like what the author is doing, is saying, I was there. This place is real. It's real to me. And so I'm recreating this map in order to show you where I was. And by the way, you can read the story about what happens in this world that I visited. What I find really interesting too is that with the media that we consume, whether it's film or games or other kinds of media, is that there's a interesting relationship that happens between when we use real place to represent fiction and vice versa. So for example, this is a map of locations used to film Star Wars movies around the world. This is only through episode 7 though. So you can see, and you can forget this Jedi population by country. We're not talking about that today. So there's all these locations where they went and filmed the Star Wars movies. And for a lot of people, the actual real world location actually becomes the location in fiction because we have such a huge affinity and affection for the fiction that that relationship gets built. So if you happen to go to Tunisia like I did, you visit the Lars homestead because that's what geeks do, like me. Or last year, the week before Gamescom, I was in Ireland, and I happened to go out to Skellig Michael, where they filmed Star Wars, the last couple of movies. And so you're recreating scenes from Star Wars because that's what like real geeks do. Or even in Dubrovnik, if you've been to the Reboot conference, you go recreate scenes from Game of Thrones. I am a tremendous geek, and this actually has relevance to this talk, as I will get to that point later. But it gets worse, trust me, because I really am quite the geek. So I have a real affinity for geek culture and an understanding of it that's pretty deep. Yes, I am a cosplayer, partly because my daughter there on the right is a professional costume designer. And so we have a lot of fun together doing these costumes. But I'm not here to talk about costumes and talk about geek stuff right now. What I'm here to talk about is culturalization. So I think most of us understand that, excuse me, my voice is really bad. Most of us understand that the global game industry is, in fact, global. I mean, the revenue that we generate in this industry comes from all around the world. And so just last year, localized versions of games tend to account for about 50% of the industry's total global revenue, that's significant. You think about the revenue numbers here, that's a significant amount of money that comes from localized versions of games. And what's fascinating, though, is if you look at the reports about where the growth is happening in the industry and out there in the different markets, a lot of the tremendous growth we're seeing is in non-traditional markets. So look at some of these numbers, like Nigeria, 22% year-over-year growth, or Kenya, or India, Vietnam. Russia, despite all of the challenges Russia has had with piracy and other issues, it's now becoming about the 6th largest market for games in the world. And then China surpassed the US last year as the largest gaming market, which was a major milestone. We kind of all knew that was going to happen, but it did happen finally. And the other thing that was interesting last year in China is that mobile games surpassed PC games, which is another huge milestone for China, because it just shows you where that growth is occurring. And so, okay, great. So we know that a lot of revenue is coming from outside of traditional markets like Western Europe and North America. So what do we do about it? Well, we've already known about localization for a long time. Localization is great. In my perspective, localization tends to focus more on language than it does on the other elements. Some people would disagree, but that's fine. It's just a matter of perspective. But this is always going to be super important. Of course, we've been localizing stuff long before games are around. I mean, all the software and other packages that we do, books, everything. I mean, localization is critical. But what we're finding more and more often in these days is that companies are thinking more about, not just about translating what we designed or translating what we made, but how do we actually design for another culture? How do we actually design with the whole world in mind? Is it possible to make something that the whole world is going to enjoy and love? And we know with our games that that's completely possible. I mean, it's very possible to create an idea that will find appeal across all boundaries, cultural, religious, and political, and otherwise. But what I find interesting in all the years I've been doing this work, I would say in the last 5 to 10 years, more and more companies are specifically starting to think about how we can actually culturalize the content, not just localize it. So here's a quick example of the difference between the two, just from my perspective. So localization makes things legible. So here is a strawberry Kit Kat bar. The top one is from Canada, because you can see it's in English and French. And the bottom one is from Japan. And so basically these are the same product, but they are in a different wrapper. So it's a language difference. Now in Japan, however, the Kit Kat candy bar is a completely different thing. It is a cultural phenomenon that has not existed anywhere else in the world. And now part of the reason for that is that the name Kit Kat is a play on a Japanese phrase, kirukatsu, which is like a really positive phrase, kind of like I'm victorious kind of thing. And so Kit Kat was very smart. In fact, they won a marketing award in 2010 for this. They were very smart to play off that Japanese phrase. And so Kit Kat, they decided to let their product be culturalized in Japan. So you can actually get different flavors in different parts of the country. And they released different flavors for many different Japanese holidays, which if you know about Japan, they have many holidays. So like you can travel around the country and collect bars from different places. And some of my Japanese colleagues have admitted to me that they have actually done this. It's fascinating because in all the years they've been doing this, there's now, I think, over 600 Kit Kat flavors in Japan throughout this program. And so again, they have culturalized the Kit Kat bar for Japan. So it's a completely different thing for this culture, and it's very relevant to this culture. And when you think about other things like collecting games like Pokemon, it should not be a surprise that it was created in Japan, because there is one cultural aspect of Japan is a collector culture. And so this whole collector idea that Kit Kat was playing off of, as does Pokemon, is just being very relevant to that specific culture. Now, there's a couple of types of culturalization that I typically deal with. The first one is reactive culturalization. That's typically when we are trying to identify and remove things in the content that is going to disrupt the user experience. And I'm going to have tons of examples, so trust me, this is the boring part. And then there's also proactive culturalization. So that's where we're actually looking for things that we can add to the content and add to the experience that's going to make it more culturally relevant to a specific region or specific country, or however you want to define that group of relevance. So here's a couple of examples. So you may recognize this. This is from the game Fallout 3 that I worked on. And this is a two-headed Brahmin bull that's wandering through the post-apocalyptic landscape. And the problem with this bull is that it's two-headed and it's radioactive, and there's all kinds of other problems. But the biggest issue is that it's a Brahmin bull, which is sacred in the Hindu faith. And so in India, there's actually laws that protect real Brahmin bulls from being harmed. And so there was enough concern from a legal standpoint that a virtual Brahmin bull that is deformed like this would cause a lot of problems. Now, we went back to the company and said, why don't we just change it to something else, like my really poorly photoshopped two-headed horse? And they said, it's too late, we can't do it, we don't have enough time. And because of that one issue, this is why the game did not sell in India, because of just that one issue. Now, conversely, when Marvel wanted to make this special edition of Spider-Man that was relevant, was local to India, they partnered with a local studio to come up with Spider-Man India. And the initial reaction was very positive. A lot of people, a lot of comic book enthusiasts in India felt this was really cool. So this is a good example of proactive culturalization. However, in the end, it really didn't do that well, because a lot of the comic book fans, if you're going to do Spider-Man, give us Peter Parker. So there's many, many languages in India. So this is a good example where localization, that may have been a better approach, where just take the original comic books and just localize them into the many, many different languages across India. But it was nice that they tried. It was a good attempt. So there's different degrees of culturalization to think about. So the first level is the reactive culturalization. The second is that's where I would put traditional localization, excuse me, and internationalization efforts. And then the third level is proactive culturalization. So if you want me to state it very simply, basically you want to make it viable, which means you want the content to stay in the market. And so some people wonder why, it doesn't have to stay in the market, it has to be localized as well into local language, but that's not always the case. I've seen a lot of situations where a game, for example, gets banned in a local market, even though it was not even intended to be there. It was not in the local language, so it doesn't really matter. The second part is make it legible so people can actually understand the content. And then the third part, which is the really tough part, this is where the proactive culturalization comes in, is try and make it meaningful. How do you make that content actually meaningful to the local user in a way that's like deeply meaningful from a cultural standpoint? And it is a difficult task to do. So typically what we're trying to do in this process of culturalizing content is taking the game worlds that we make and trying to see how do we infuse these with the local worldviews in order to end up with a culturalized experience. And this is where I do much of my work, is in that zone, because there are things that will be compatible and there are things that are incompatible with the different, between the culture of the game and the culture of the local market. And so that's where I do my work, is in trying to understand what will or will not be compatible. In a typical development cycle, this is very simplified by the way, but in a typical development cycle, a lot of time localization tends to happen later because obviously you have to wait for the content to be complete enough so that it can be translated, even though localization should start at the very beginning, just like everything. But a lot of the work that happens with culturalization happens early. And the reason for that is because I'm sitting down, for example, when I work on a BioWare game, I'm sitting down right at the beginning and I read the early script, I see the concept art, I talk to the artists and the writers and the producers to understand what world are you building, who's in it, what do they do, what kind of factions are in there, are there any religions, is there politics, is there an economic system? Basically, I need to understand the world that they're creating in order to give them early feedback and guidance on things that may or may not work. And so they can change that very early on, which is very easy and cheap to do compared to finding out something like late in the product cycle where you're about to ship and you find out, oh crap, this is something we need to change. Now, typically though, this is an iterative process that cycle happens throughout the entire product cycle. So we go through this whole thing of identifying, and then we try and triage, and then we just make a decision on how we're gonna change something, and then we implement the change. It's not something that we wait for the whole product cycle to happen. This is something that happens very quickly, almost on a daily basis sometimes. So during this process though, there's many, many things we have to think about. So first of all, really important is the high-level corporate values and goals. So, and when I say this, I mean, who in the company gets to decide what's the ethical stance for that company? For example, is the company going to recognize Taiwan as an independent country or not? That's a decision you have to make. Even if it's in fiction in a game, that could cause huge repercussions for you in China if you decided to do that, even in a fictional context. But somebody in that company needs to make that decision. So like when I was at Microsoft, for example, at one point I asked Bill Gates, who's the moral compass of Microsoft? Because I figured it's him, he's the guy at the top. But he pointed to me and said, that's your job. And I said, I'm not paid enough to be the moral compass of Microsoft. But what he meant is that if someone in his high level of visibility made a decision like that, think what happens. Then if they find out, then the stock drops and people panic and they get afraid of Microsoft. But if I make that mistake, they can quietly eject me out the airlock and just say, well, it was just someone's mistake. We've taken care of it. But this is really important in making these kinds of decisions. And you'll see examples of this later. Also, the context in which content is generated is also very important. Because as we know, when we outsource content to all these places around the world, every single one of us has a different view of the world. We all grew up with a different worldview. I'm originally from Southern California. I've lived on the West Coast of the US almost my entire life. So I have a very West Coast US way of looking at the world. And what does that look like? Well, I don't know. We don't need to get into that. But we all have that. So my point is that we all have bias, whether we like it or not. And so we need to identify what our biases might be when we're generating content. The other thing is the business strategy. So if you're a larger company like the Sony or Microsoft, companies like that, they do more than just games. Games are just one vertical that they work on. So we have to think about what are the goals for that vertical, what's the market strategy for a specific country or region, what's the market strategy for a specific game, and then also the changing geopolitical, cultural, and ethical issues that are constantly dynamic as we go about our business. A lot of people think that a lot of these issues are static, that politics doesn't change, that cultural values don't change, but I think we know that they do very frequently, actually. I mean, just in August of last year, the USK in Germany decided that it's okay now to show swastikas and Hitler's face in some games that you release in Germany. You still have to be very careful about it, but this was a major change in policy for the German market. And so let me get into a few aspects of world building as I get deeper into this. So there's some core aspects of world building to think about. So the first is the context. Does this take place in the real world or the fictional world? The next part is the complexity, about the degree of realization. And the third one is about intent. So using different kinds of techniques and tools, which I will describe, and how we use thematic layers to basically build out the world and build out the experience for players. So the first one, real world and fictional world. Well, as we know, it doesn't have to be black and white. There's a lot of games that fall somewhere in between. It tends to be a huge zone of overlap and interaction between fictional and real world. I mean, like I said, Assassin's Creed, where you actually use the real world, but you have a fictional narrative laid on top of it, is kind of closer over here. Or something like Grand Theft Auto 5, which is almost exactly like the real world, but not exactly. It's kind of like right on the edge. It's what like I said, I call it hyperreal. And of course, things like Skyrim or things like that are like way over as completely fictional universes. And that's pretty easy to figure out. The other thing that I think is really important to emphasize is when I'm talking about the world building, I'm talking about realization, not realism. And by realism, I mean just like a lot of times when you say realism, you think about like photorealistic quality, like Skyrim looks real, it has like pretty mountains and stuff that look realistic. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about when I talk about realization, I'm talking about how much world do you need to build in order to satisfy the experience that is designed for the user? So, for example, the way I see it, you take the narrative goals of the game, and my premise is that every single game has a narrative. Even simple casual games have some kind of narrative that they are built on initially. And then you have the experience goals. What is the player going to be doing while they're in this narrative? And those two together basically help you figure out what the realization goals are going to be. It's actually one of the biggest mistakes I've ever seen in all my years working on games is that people overbuild. They way overbuild their worlds and over-engineer them and create way too much stuff when they don't really need to because they went way beyond the narrative and experience goals. And I don't know why they did that. They just felt it would be cool to have like a whole nother city where nothing happens, or I don't know. So here's a quick recipe for realizing worlds. So first you take a dash of cultural evidence, and I will explain each of these. A big chunk of logical consistency, a hint of complex systems, what we call topology, and then a foundation of familiarity in the world by using thematic layers. So don't worry, I'm going to explain all of this. So cultural evidence, what is that? So that's basically, the goal here is creating stuff in the environment that builds out the world itself. So the goal is really to make use the most minimal amount of content to convey the presence of in-game culture. So this is where I see a lot of games build way too much stuff in order to show basically what the culture needs to be. So you're setting the context for the world, whatever it might be, but you don't want to overcreate. Because the highest risk activity I see when I work with a lot of teams on different projects is when you decide, here's what the world is, here's who's in it, here's what the narrative is and all these other things. Everyone is set loose to do their jobs, the artists do their job and the writers and everyone else, and then they just start creating all kinds of stuff, and sometimes it's without any kind of guidance or oversight. And so I see stuff thrown into the environment, and I'm just like, oh my God, why is that in here? This has nothing to do with this world. It has nothing to do with this game. And, sometimes they're like, well, I think it's cool, so I just want to put it in there. And so this is what I call backfilling of content, and it happens in a lot of different games. And this is where it tends to be high risk because every individual creator is kind of putting in their own inspiration into the environment. And if somebody isn't kind of stepping back and saying, wait a minute, I'm not sure, how does that relate to the narrative? I don't get it. So there's two key things. One is don't be lazy with this. So, and I hate to use that term, but I'll give you an example of what that looks like. So, but basically every time we create something, it has to be created with a purpose. I'm putting this thing in the environment, even this crate in the corner over there in this town, because, you know, it has a certain purpose to be there. And somebody has to ask the hard, challenging questions sometimes. Like if someone creates a symbol for a certain faction in the game, it's like, okay, where did you get the inspiration for the symbol? Can you show me your inspiration? Tell me your thought process. And it's not, the hard part here is that a lot of times, especially people coming from a creative background, they take offense at this because they think that their creative abilities are being questioned. But that's not what you're not questioning their skill. You're just trying to understand the thought process behind putting that thing into the environment or creating that experience and how it relates back to the narrative and the experience goals for the entire game. So here's a piece of cultural evidence. This is from Jade Empire, the BioWare game way back when. And this was a hallway in which, because this game, if you have not played Jade Empire, it was based on Asian culture. It's kind of a pan-Asian culture that is heavily influenced by China, but it has little bits of Japanese and Korean and India as well in there. And what the artists did is they put these cylinders in the hallway, and what they were is they actually looked originally like these, which are Tibetan Buddhist prayer wheels. So they are from Tibetan Buddhism, but the Buddhism doesn't exist in this game, and we're not supposed to have prayer wheels in this game, and it was too late to actually completely take them out structurally. So you can see instead we put this kind of blue haze around them, so like energy cylinders instead. So they look kind of spooky and cool. But this is an example where they just kind of threw it in the environment because from that particular artist standpoint, we're making a game based on Asia. It's like, well, we were, but not really. It was not supposed to have anything to do with our world. And so they used a cultural artifact that should not be there. Logical consistency is also a really important concept. This is actually something that we use in geography all the time, is this concept that if you have a data set of like elevation points, for example, if you have one elevation point that's 5,000 meters among ones that are like 500 meters, that's kind of weird. Why would this one point be like so much different? That's what would be logically inconsistent with the rest of the data. And so a lot of times when we're building worlds, we're looking for things too that might be logically inconsistent with the environment. Like why is it there? So a lot of times players, they do respond really well when they understand that the world has a system, even if it's completely fantasy based, like if there's magic or if there's the Force or there's some other thing that is unworldly, even that needs to have some kind of logic to it in order for it to kind of feel real. So we don't want to have a contradiction in the world systems. We also want to make sure that there's no conflict going on between what appears in the world and basically the intent and the narrative that's in the world. Here's another example that's a little bit similar to the Jade Empire one, but this is from the game Cameo. And again, Cameo that takes place in a completely fictional fantasy universe. And you can see the artist put here these wooden crosses to mark for a grave. And so I had to ask them, well, what are those supposed to be? They said, well, they're grave markers. I said, well, that's interesting because Christianity doesn't exist in this universe. So why in the world would they be using a wooden cross? And the answer I got back from them verbatim is they said, what else would I use? I'm like, I don't know, you're paid to be creative. Maybe like go over there in a corner and create something. Maybe figure out what a grave marker would look like for this universe. That sounds like a fun project to me. Then another concept is the idea of topology, which some games have used really, really well. Again, topology, this is another concept that actually comes from geography, although you also use it in networking science as well. And topology is really focused on the issue of why and how things are related, not distance. That would be topography, which talks about elevation and distance and things like that. Topology is more about just what's the relationship between this thing and that thing. Like me, I'm a speaker on a stage. That is a topological relationship. You are attendees at a conference. That is a topological relationship. So a lot of times, topology can be applied to a lot of different things in the game universe. It can be applied to objects and characters. And also, it really can also help convey the sense of a much larger world without actually building the world. So I'll give you a couple examples. So if you played the original Halo games, one thing they did really well in Halo, because it's a first-person shooter with a very linear course of action, where you're just shooting, going down a very well-defined path, but they put things in the environment that hinted at the race called the Forerunners, who actually built the Halo rings. And if you had enough time to kind of sneak around different little corners and stuff, you could find these clues about the Forerunners and who they were. And they didn't really give you much of a hint of who they were, but it was enough to make you really wonder there's a much bigger universe at play here. There's a whole nother course of action that happened in relationship to the creation of these rings. And it was really cool to kind of have that sense of discovery without action. And you didn't have to, the designers did not have to build anything. All they did was like make a little interface that had like a little text message that rolled up and told people about the history. And that's all you had to do. If you saw the movie Rogue One, I think they did an excellent job of this in Rogue One. Now, this character, Chirrut Imwe, they called him a guardian of the wills. And if you're old enough like me and know your Star Wars lore, the word wills was used in the original draft that George Lucas made for the original Star Wars film. So it was called a Journal of the Wills. And so for those of us who saw this movie and they used that word, that was like a huge geek moment, because oh my God, that actually they're using that word in a canon film. So now it's become part of like the official Star Wars canon. And that was kind of cool, but then they didn't explain anything about it. They just mentioned that once in the movie, and then they just moved on. But it has you wondering, well, who the hell was this guy? And other little things like this, like when they pulled away with the camera shot, and you see that this mountain range is actually like a fallen Jedi statue. I mean, that hints that something tremendous happened here, or there was some kind of other major cultural event or something going on here, but they never mention anything more. They just show it and they move on. And so that kind of thing can be really powerful in conveying culture within a game without actually having to build it out. Now, one of the things that geographers are really good at is we are good world builders because we spend all of our time deconstructing this world. And the way that we deconstruct the world is with our cartographic tools. We basically build the world into layers. And so this is the way we view the world. Geographic information systems, basically that's how they're organized. And so we divide up the world in different thematic layers. And so we do our analysis between the different layers to see what kind of relevance is out there. And I've encouraged a lot of game developers as they create their games to think about the world building in this way. So how many layers do you really need? Do you need, for example, these are just sample layers here. I'm not going to go down this whole list, but there's a lot of different layers here. And if I really wanted to get really detailed, this list would go to the center of the earth. But you think about games that you've played where certain elements are useful or not useful. For example, in Breath of the Wild, the atmosphere and the climate has a lot to do with the game. They use the weather system all the time, and it influences the gameplay tremendously, where I've seen a lot of other games where they have a weather system, but it does nothing. All it's there for is just to create atmosphere, but it doesn't really have an effect on the player or the gameplay. So you have to ask yourself, well, do we really need a climate model in our game or not? And there's a lot of other things you have to think about, like hydrologic systems, water systems, plate tectonics. How did your world get built in the mountain ranges and everything, and all these other factors, language, history, symbology, all the cultural systems. Any one of those can be super complex. The faith system, political system, the economic system, and so on. And so this is the kind of thing that I think for some game developers, it really helps them to understand, okay, well, this lets me step back a minute and look at the narrative I'm designing and looking at the experience goals, as I mentioned before, and say, okay, at its very core, I might only need, let's say, 10 layers. And then if I have time, I can kind of build out other things that makes the game a little more enriched. But really, at its core, I only need, these few layers to really realize my world, and I don't need any more than that. So that's why I often tell them to focus on building just those few and do them really well. And if it works, then think about what else you might want to do to enhance the game. Now, from a culturalization standpoint, there's 5 major cultural layers that have often caused the biggest problems, and that's what I'm going to focus on. And some of these are probably, most all of these should be pretty obvious, but the use of history, the use of faith and religion, inclusion and exclusion, which I will describe what that means, the intercultural dissonance between different cultures or regions, and then the geopolitical imaginations of governments. So this basically relates more to maps. So let's look at the first one with history. So historical memory in a lot of countries is very persistent. And this is something that especially people in North America don't realize because it's such a young continent. It's only 200 something years old, 300 years old or so, at least from a European invasion standpoint, not from an indigenous standpoint. But a lot of other cultures around the world, especially East Asian cultures, South Asian culture, they have their roots go back millennia. And so a lot of the cultures that exist today, if you base your game in history, they're not going to easily forget or just brush off that you got something wrong. So this is an example that got us into a lot of trouble on the original Age of Empires. And so in this scenario, what you see here is the Korean Peninsula over on the left. And the red group is the Choson Empire that existed in the Middle Ages. And then in the blue is Japan, and that's the Yamatos. And basically what history tells us, what history books will show, is that the Japanese invaded the Choson Empire and essentially almost took it over. And so the reason they put this scenario in the game is because it's very challenging. You're playing as the Choson, so it's very difficult to win this scenario. So the game gets released. And this is way back in August of 1997. And the game gets released, and it was immediately banned by the Korean government. And the Korean Ministry of Information said that this never happened. So what are we supposed to do? So think back to that slide I said about multiple considerations, things you have to think about with these sort of decisions. So think about it. This is Microsoft, early days of its gaming platform. It's doing games on PC. The Xbox still didn't exist at that point. So they're like, okay, well, we want to grow our games business. So we have to get this game out. Tremendous amount of work was put into this game. Market research also showed that RTS games, the real-time strategy games, were very popular in Korea. And if you know your history of Korean gaming, 1 year later, 1998, is when StarCraft came out, which has become a national phenomenon in Korea to this very day. So we knew RTS games were popular, and this is an RTS game. And so basically we put all these factors together and we have to release this game, but what are we going to do? So eventually we made a decision that we were going to change history. And so we created a patch only for Korean players in which the Koreans invade Japan instead of the other way around. And as you might imagine, the people on the development team, there were a lot of angry discussions about truth and history and what's the nature of truth and the ethics of doing something like this. And it was a really good conversation to have, and I'm glad it happened. But one of the things I had to remind them, a few years earlier, I worked on Encarta Encyclopedia at Microsoft, and in the French and Italian versions, we had different, we basically had different heights for Mont Blanc, and we also had different ownership. Because, as some of you know, the two governments have not always agreed on who actually owns the peak of Mont Blanc. And so that's the actual physical fact of a mountain that was different in an encyclopedia. And we had, throughout the different encyclopedia versions, we had different inventors of the radio and things like that, because that encyclopedia had to align with educational standards in different countries. Well, here we come along with a game in which we have a scenario that's a bit different. And so basically, what I was getting at is we're trying to serve the local experience. We're trying to serve the local expectation. And the local expectation in Korea is not the top version, it's the bottom one. And even though that it makes us feel very uncomfortable changing history like that, but that's what we had to do, both for business reasons and for content reasons. Another more recent example, this is a game that actually never released because of historical reasons, but it's because it's too recent. So this is a game that took place in the Battle of Fallujah in Iraq back in 2004, and a lot of the people, like the retailers and others, especially in the US, they did not want to put this game on the shelf because they felt it's too recent. You know, there's troops that died over there, and it was a very controversial battle, and it's like they just felt very uncomfortable using something so recent, and so this game never released. So faith, so dealing with cultures that maintain their expectations that are based on their religious beliefs, something we have to be very careful about. So even in somewhere like the UK, it can be sensitive, because when Resistance Fall of Man came out, the Church of England was really upset that the Manchester Cathedral there was actually, they weren't upset that it was actually recreated. What they were more upset about is that the action went into the church and actually destroyed the church, or at least part of the church, and that's the part they didn't like. And so the Church of England has created what they call sacred digital guidelines. So if you want to recreate a Church of England facility in a game, you have to get their approval, which I can guarantee you probably won't. That's why they created the guidelines. It's basically a checkpoint for them to just say, oh, you're making a game with our church? No, not going to happen. And things like this. Hitman 2 sort of did the same thing, where they took the action of the game into the most sacred site of the Sikh faith in Amritsar, the Golden Temple in India. And here you have the main character, the protagonist, antagonist, whatever he is, killing Sikhs in their most sacred place. It's like, that's really not cool. And that got a very negative reaction as a result. Or games like this MOBA called Smite, in which they take pantheons of different gods and they throw them together to fight each other. Now they have the Egyptian gods, they've got the Norse gods. Most of those are not worshipped by very many people at all anymore. There's very few people who worship them still. But then they took all the gods of the Hindu pantheon and also put them in the game, thinking that the Hindu gods are like, well, they're kind of antiquated, just like the Egyptian and Norse gods, where you actually have about 1 billion people who worship the Hindu gods. So there was a lot of backlash against this game. A lot of people were very uncomfortable with that and felt that it was not a good thing to do. And of course, the game, though, they never changed it, though. They've even to this day, they left all of those in there. And of course, people have joked as well, why don't you just get it over with and put Moses and Jesus and Muhammad and everyone else in there and just have a huge religious battle. And this is where we also have to be careful about icon design. When we're designing icons for different software packages or whatever it might be, you can see here, like in Office XP and in MSN, they came up with these icons for content which is directly as opposed to the values of Islam. And yet the icons look very similar to the Islamic halal. And so we have to be really careful about how we depict things like this, because we think it's a really smart, cool idea, and on the other side, in another market, they're going to say you're basically co-opting our religious symbol for a negative purpose. Inclusion and exclusion is a broad category of issues that happen where people perceive that they're being treated inequitably on the basis of their culture or their gender or their nationality or many other different things. So it's basically a feeling that I'm being excluded from the experience because of this. And so one of the ones that has been, that happened several years ago with Resident Evil 5 is when you had the image that they were showing before the game came out, where you see this nice Caucasian guy shooting sub-Saharan African villagers in a poor village in Africa. And so the game developers, they're like, well, what's the big deal? They're zombies. Look, you have to kill them. But the game developers, the people who made this game, did not have the cultural context to understand why this is so sensitive. To understand the imagery that has gone with this over the past 100 years, the notions of the Dark Continent and the Great White Hunter and all that kind of stuff. And this is where we have to also go back to that point I made earlier about the context in which content is created. This game was created primarily in Japan, and Japan is 98% ethnic Japanese. The concept of diversity as we tend to see it in the West is not the same as it is in Japan. And so would you expect those developers in Japan to understand this difference and understand this kind of tension that exists, this sort of racial tension? Now, I would say yes, I do expect them to, because I expect them to do their research. That's what they should have done. But are they going to know it inherently? And they didn't. And that's part of the problem, is that they didn't even know that they should have researched it. And so there's a huge knowledge gap there, and that can be a problem. That's why having some kind of additional oversight is really important, so that we kind of avoid these kinds of problems. And even things like this with Pocket God, which you may have seen this game. It was an early game on the iPhone way back when. And the original developers of this game said, you could see this very antiquated depiction of indigenous people with the bone in the hair and the sharp pointy teeth. They're very animal-like with grass skirts. And the developer of this game said, well, what's the big deal? This has nothing to do with real worlds at all. They're just fictional little characters. And by the way, if you have not played this game, the whole point of the game is to torture and kill them. So you could make the volcano explode, and you could feed them to sharks and all kinds of things. But the developer kept saying it's a fictional world. Really? Well, what is that object over there on the right side of the island? That is a moai that exists only in one place on Earth, on Easter Island. So by using that object, they instantly created this as one specific culture. So the people who are from that culture had every reason to be upset, because by using that artifact, you have made it into that culture. And so in the later version of the game, they actually came up with their own version, which had nothing to do with the moai from Easter Island. Other things like this, when using the use of 4 fingers, some of you may have heard this issue in Japan about using 4 fingers on a human character. It's a very, very sensitive issue, especially as the character becomes more human-like. So like, for example, the Bugs Bunny and the Simpsons, they're willing to watch those because they're sort of, they're anthropomorphic, but they're not really human. Whereas this character is kind of more human. And so we had to change this character because of the 4-fingered issue. And basically what it is, it relates to a class issue in Japan, a class called the Barakumen, which basically they are the people who did the butcher and the tanning work. They worked with animals. And so back in the 19th century in Japan, you would flash 4 fingers as a sign that you're like low. You're like on the lowest point of society. And so people today who are descendants of the Barakumen, they will actually go after companies that do this because they feel that you're offending them and who they are. Other things like this, like even simple marketing things where you can see this is a standard image that was created for marketing of Microsoft's tools. And so when this went to Poland, however, if you watch closely in the middle, they did a really poor Photoshop job of this man in the middle, because they felt that the ethnic diversity being portrayed in this image did not match the ethnic diversity in Poland, which are not very many people of African descent in Poland. And so they decided to go ahead and do this, which was a huge problem. And people are not stupid. They saw that they did this, and they got a lot of backlash for it, as they should, because they could have just used this image anyway. But they decided to, they didn't even change his hand either. So, it just, this version looks like his neck is broken. But anyway, even simple things like that, we have to be very conscious of those changes. Also, intercultural dissonance. So when we have tension between different cultures and nationalities, it can happen for a wide variety of issues. It can be historical, it can be ethnic, it could be political. So here's another Age of Empires example from Korea. I'm not trying to pick on them, it's just a good example. So this box art, a lot of Korean retailers did not want to have it on their shelf when the game came out. And usually I ask the question in the audience, but for the sake of time, I'll just tell you the reason why they didn't want it on the shelf is because of the Japanese samurai. But the real reason is because when this came out, it was right at a time where Japan and Korea were going at each other because of a geopolitical dispute in the middle of the Sea of Japan, which Korea calls the East Sea. And it's 2 little rocks called Dokdo in Korea, or Takashima in Japanese. And because they were at a height of tension, a lot of Korean retailers didn't want anything to do with Japanese goods. And so because the box had a Japanese samurai, they didn't want to stock the box. They didn't want to put it on their shelf. And so this actually had nothing to do with the game itself. It was a game that was kind of caught in the crossfire of current affairs, of current issues. And that's something we really don't have much control over, except trying to maybe postpone the launch, or maybe just don't use that box art. We could have changed the artwork instead. Now, when the expansion pack to this game came out, most of the world saw the version on top with Montezuma, but Korea got to have their own special box art, and that was sort of a way to make up for them because we made them angry with the samurai. So instead, we put a Korean general on the box art for the expansion pack. So that made them happy. And things like Dance Central. I've worked on all of these dancing games because I'm looking for gestures and body language that could be sensitive. Joanna mentioned some great examples earlier in her talk about different gestures that can be problematic. And so Yeah, so like in this game, there were, when I was working on the very first build of this game, every single dance ended like this, with the hands splayed out like that. And actually, they did that motion at the end of the dance. And if you know, if you're from Greece or you know about Greece, that is the motza. And so basically, that's the same as doing this at the end of the dance. And so can you imagine every dance ending in that way? Or this, or whatever your flavor is. So, so we have to be very sensitive about that kind of thing. And it also representation issues. This is just one example. I actually think it's great how Lara Croft has gone from being sort of the symbol of sexist representation to being someone who is actually one of the better representations of women in games now, in my opinion. I worked on Rise of the Tomb Raider, so I'm a little bit biased, but I really like who she has become as a character in these games. And a lot of that is also due to Rhianna Pratchett's, her amazing writing and kind of fleshing out this character as a more well-rounded human being. Here's another example as well, when this is kind of the road to hell is paved with good intentions. This was a desktop image made for Windows that was going to be made for the Indonesian government. So it was a special version for the Indonesian government. And the problem here is that you can see they use this photographic filter effect with the red and the blue at the bottom. Well, the problem is that Indonesia, they used to be a colony of the Netherlands. And so, so you can see that is a not so subtle message you're sending to the government of Indonesia that, guess what, you used to be part of the Netherlands, maybe you didn't know that, but we're gonna remind you. Yeah, so even things like that, it can be very subtle, but we have to be very careful about that sort of thing. And then lastly, with the geopolitical imaginations, this is basically where governments like to reinforce what they own, the territorial control. So this has to do with a lot of map issues and political issues. So like Hearts of Iron, these games were banned in China because they did not show all of Chinese territory as being one territory, especially Tibet and Taiwan. They were really not happy about that. And what's interesting though is they banned these games even though they take place in World War II, and the People's Republic of China did not exist until 1949, 4 years after the war. And so basically the Chinese government likes to reinforce their sovereignty even before they existed. And if you're following all the news, so what's happening in the South China Sea down there, that's exactly the basis why they're building fake islands in the South China Sea, is because they claim a historical right to the territory that goes back centuries. But I'm not going to get into that today. Another thing, like UI screens like this was a massive problem because this would be instantly banned in China for 3 reasons. One, you're calling Taiwan ROC, Republic of China. You cannot use that name in China. You're using the Taiwan flag, which you also cannot show in China. And then you're also calling ROC a country, which is a huge offense. So this is, when you do something like this in the UI, it is a huge political statement that you're making here. And so one of the things that I've done for a lot of companies is basically, we don't use flags. I really don't like using flags for language or locale. They're redundant information. So in this case, we use Taiwan because both sides use the name. Taiwan calls themselves Taiwan. China calls it Taiwan. And then we say country/region. So then you kind of defer the judgment to the user. So is Taiwan a country? Well, if you're pro-independence and you live in Taiwan, you can say, I'm selecting Taiwan the country. And if you're in China and you think it's a province of China, it's just a region. And so you kind of step away from that problem and don't have to deal with it. This kind of stuff happens all the time in cartography. This is one of the things I did for Google for 6 years when I was working with them. To consult for them, is we perfected what we call domain tailoring, so that in cartography, like in India, you have to show the map like the version on the right with Jammu and Kashmir as being Indian territory, or else you instantly get banned by the government. And so there's a lot of different examples like this around the world. And also things like using country region lists, we have to be very careful about that. Like this version where they actually put the Basque Country as a country, which if you know Spain, I mean, that's like really sensitive to put them as an independent country. And again, using flags for language and locale can be really problematic. Because like in this example, the Saudi Arabian flag has sacred text from the Quran in the middle of the flag. So when you reduce that flag down to just a few green and white pixels, you're actually distorting the sacred word from the Quran. And so I frankly would rather not take that risk. of having that kind of backlash. I'd rather just not use it. So I'm going to close here. So a few last considerations. So the target audience, there's two key audiences for game content. So first is the intended audience. And that's basically people who play our games. We're not worried about these people when it comes to a lot of the culturalization issues because they understand game content, they understand context. And then there's also the unintended audience. These are the people who tend to not play games and they'll see something out of context and they're the ones that get really crazy and go contact the government or somebody else and say this needs to be banned or this needs to be regulated. So the work that I do is the proactive culturalization is mainly intended for the intended audience. So we want to enhance the experience for people who play the games and understand the games, and the reactive work is done to basically minimize the chances of those unintended people reacting in a negative way. And so that tends to be how I look at my work. The other things we need to think about is when we distribute in the content cloud today, we have that instant exposure and reaction. When we're also instantly exposed to a broad multicultural audience. And as we all know, once it's out there, it's out there. You cannot take it back. So you have to do everything you can to ensure that when you release, it is as good as it can get. And if you think there might be a problem with something you've created, then you need to be ready to defend it or to explain yourself. Because we have community activism at every level, because we know when they love your game, you get a massive outpouring of love from around the world. And if they don't like your game or you did something culturally insensitive, you cannot hide because they are coming for you. And really what's at the root of a lot of these issues is this battle for mind share. A lot of the governments and the cultural institutions that exist in a lot of these countries, they're competing for public mind share. And they feel that media like games are this negative influence that's coming into their country that's going to change the minds of their citizens. That's why the Great Firewall of China exists, is because of this perceived problem. And so I'm not saying we need to change our creative vision. I'm saying we just need to be mindful of the fact that this is a culture war that's going on. So remember I was showing all the cosplay pictures and all that geek stuff as well. Just a little note about that is that understanding precedent is also very important, because understanding what games have been able to do in the past. So like if you're working on a topic that you think might be controversial, you can say, well, that game got away with it, or that movie did, or you can look at other media around that topic that might already have served as a precedent. It's kind of like the same way lawyers do. When they're going to take a case, they research past cases and see what the precedent was in law. I do the same thing when I'm researching for a client. I'm trying to see if anything around the same topic was banned or had a problem in the past. And being a geek helps because I consume a lot of different geek media. And then lastly, this issue of freedom of creativity, because a lot of times on the culturalization topic, there's pushback from game developers to say, well, I should be allowed to make anything I want. I mean, why should I have to change anything? And my point is you don't. I actually believe in free speech. I think it's a great thing. So I think people should exercise their creative vision, but they have to make sure they understand that creative vision doesn't always align with other cultures. And so we need to do our part to make sure that experience for that local person is not going to be disruptive. They're playing a game, they're enjoying this game, and all of a sudden they see a gesture or a symbol or a character design or something in there that kind of jolts them out of the experience, and all of a sudden they're not playing the game. Now they're wondering why this game developer or why this company took the time to do something that offends their culture. And that's not the kind of thing we want to see happen. And we need to be willing to have those challenging discussions around ethics and intent. And I know they can be really uncomfortable at times, but I think they're really healthy for us to discuss these kind of issues. Say, what does the diversity of our characters look like? Are we being inclusive enough? Have we implemented accessibility? Are we dealing with a subject matter that's highly sensitive that maybe we should think twice about? I mean, I was involved in Call of Duty Modern Warfare and that whole Russian airport scene. So that's one of those issues where you have to really think about what's the ethics of doing something like this. And I won't get into that right now. And finally, this issue of competing goals of art versus commerce, because this really does influence how we do our world design and how we build the experience for the players. Are we striving purely for artistic freedom in which case you don't care about making money, you just care about the creative vision of the game. And this is where a lot of indies live. A lot of indies have the freedom to live in that space because they're kind of pursuing the creative joy of it first before the revenue part. Whereas a lot of studios, especially the larger publishers, they have to maximize revenue. They have stockholders. They've got people expecting them to make money. And so that's often why you'll see on that end of the spectrum, that's why you'll see Call of Duty 25 and Halo 15 and all these franchises that keep repeating and repeating because they know they make money. And so because they need to make money. So you can kind of decide which is more important. Well, everyone needs to figure that out. It's kind of what I call the fulcrum of compromise between, are we striving purely for artistic freedom? And I think most of us, we want artistic freedom, but we also want to make a living, which means we also have to think about the market forces and how we have to change our content appropriately to make sure that the user experience ultimately is a positive one. There you go.
Do we have, so maybe, we don't have a lot of time. Maybe one question, okay. Would having a more diverse workforce in the gaming industry solve a lot of these issues?
That is a great question. It would solve many of the issues, yes, because that's one of the reasons why in the course of my work, especially in the last 10 years, I've focused so much on advocacy work in the industry. That's why I took the IGDA job. That's why I'm on the board of Take This, that deals with mental health in the game industry, because I want to see the industry be better, and I truly believe that our creative efforts will only get better the more diverse that we get. You get people from different cultures, you get different genders, you get people in there who represent all these different perspectives, and you can only have a better outcome, in my opinion.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. So yeah, I think we need to wrap up, and it's funny because I just asked Kate right before she went on stage when your book is coming out. So yeah, I hope one day we can read you and get all your insight in your book. So thank you so much, Kate. Again,
Thank you.
It was great having you tonight.
Thank you. My voice.